everybody. Welcome. Here we are at another episode of Freedom Hub Working Group. Another exciting guest in store for you today. You're going to find out that we've got some additional videos as we go along, and this one will be released. But just to give you a quick diversion here, this is the location for them. That was the domain for you to go to. You'll see there's an awful lot here. Please feel free to share. We're not only on Brighteon here, but also on BitChute and shortly on YouTube. So we'll have these all available for you there to share as readily as you can. And then also remember, we are being sponsored by Your Freedom Hub. So we've got all sorts of kind of cutting edge and kind of industry disruptive technologies and services in here for you. And as I said today, we've got a great guest. So I'm going to start out by letting Charles give us an introduction there on him. And if you would.
Sure, Jeff. So for about 3 decades now, students at Ramapo College, or is it Ramapo?
No, it's Ramapo.
Ramapo in New Jersey have known Professor Sabrin as a professor of finance and liberty activist in New Jersey of both the Republican and Libertarian Party. Know Murray as a dependable candidate for statewide office, Senate, and other districts. And he's got a couple books to his name, one from, well over a dozen years ago on tax freedom. And then a recent book that the Fed Sucks, which is, I think a good title. There's so many books about the Federal Reserve are somewhat high-handed. So just say what it is. It sucks. So Murray did. Murray is a prolific author. He writes a great blog. And we're very excited to hear him talk about the next half century. I think I saw him write an article about that a few months ago, and I definitely wanted him to do a whole webinar on that, because if we can't really have an idea of what's going to come in our lives over the next decade, several decades, we should know that. I mean, if we're really good at policy, we should know that so we can prepare. So, Murray, that's the introduction there, Jeff.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to shift the sharing responsibility now. If you'll bring the screen up, you're good to go there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeff and Charlie, for inviting me today. I have a presentation. The first go-round of this took place last October as my farewell address as part of the Rossetti Memorial Lecture we do every year at the business school in honor of the late dean who served admirably as the dean of the business school and some other administrative positions, also a professor of economics. And so the dean invited me this year to give my farewell address and talk about America the next 70 years. And why is it 70 years? Well, last August was the 70th anniversary of coming to America. On August 6, 1949, I came to America with my parents and my older brother. And I'm going to go through these slides and explain how the last 70 years has affected my intellectual development and how it affects my view of the world and what I think is going to happen in the next 70 years. And we have to remember that predictions is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. That was a great quote from Niels Bohr, the Nobel Award-winning physicist. And there's another great quote from one of the most insightful analysts of the 20th century, Peter Drucker, who said the best way to predict the future is create it. And I've been involved in the freedom movement, I guess, since the early 70s when I started reading Murray Rothbard's work and became involved in the Austrian libertarian movement by learning Austrian economics as a young graduate student at Rutgers in the 1970s. And I was fortunate to have Murray Rothbard as a member of my dissertation committee. He was an outside member. I was allowed one outside member. And I'm only one of 2 people in the world who had Murray Rothbard as a member of a doctoral dissertation committee. So I'm very proud of that, and I'm proud of the dissertation. And next year will be the 40th anniversary of my dissertation, how inflation spreads through this economy based upon Austrian insights about how money is created and spreads through the banking system and raises prices at various geographic locations where that money is infused into the economy. Well, here's a picture of me right before we came to America on August 6, 1949. I told my parents I should have been a Gerber baby and I would have had royalties for life. So that's what it was like looking in West Germany, where I was born right after World War II. And here's a picture of my father on the right-hand side in July 1944 when his area of Poland was liberated by the Russian army, and he was a partisan commander. He was in charge of 230 some odd people, and for a year they fought the Nazis in Germany, and he wrote his memoirs, We Dare to Live, and there he is in the center instructing one of his partisans on how to shoot accurately, and he had tales of heroism throughout the book. And the thing that he didn't tell me while he was alive, and I didn't know this till I read the book, at the end of the book, when the Russians liberated his part of Poland, he was asked by the two Russian colonels, I believe, or generals, to lead a band of partisans into Germany, parachute them in order to disrupt the war. And he said, basically, fellas, I'm done with the war. I fought for 5 years since I was invaded in 1939, and he refused to go unless they ordered him to go. And so he left the meeting, and he never heard from the generals again. Then a few months later, he found out that of the 40 people who were selected to parachute into Germany to disrupt the German supply lines and other facilities, all but 2 survived. So it was fortunate that he made that decision not to go into Germany on this, what turned out to be a suicide mission. And because of that, I'm here speaking to you about why we need to rev up the freedom movement in the United States, because there are some ominous developments on the horizon. So my journey in America begins in 1950. Here I am in the middle between 2 girls, and my older brother is in back of me with another young girl. I have no idea who they are. They were pictures that we found after my mother passed away, and I just have no idea who these young people are except for my brother. And in 1959, I raised my right hand in Lower Manhattan and became a U.S. citizen. We were living in New York City at the time. And you can see I had the Elvis Presley hairdo, who was very popular in America in the late 50s. And so I swore to uphold the Constitution. I wish people in Congress and presidents and Supreme Court judges did the same thing. Then we wouldn't have all these encroachments on our liberties and freedoms and interventions in the economy and interventions all over the world. And then nearly a decade later, I married Florence Michelle, and we've been together now for 51 years. And you can see me in my horn-rimmed glasses, and there's a resemblance to the very popular singer from the 1950s who unfortunately died tragically in a plane crash at age 22, and that's Buddy Holly. I never realized that till I put together this presentation. So let's rehash the last 200 years, according to Warren Buffett. The good news, America has been an incredible place for economic development and economic growth because of free enterprise and limited government. And that's the point that Buffett made in one of his letters to shareholders. And I think he was right on target with what we've seen over the past 200 plus years. The US economy has gone from a nation of 3 million people to over 300 million people with an incredible standard of living. So that is the really good news. And as I'll point out, it's going to continue for the next 70 years. And look at these innovations. And I have several slides of all the innovations of the past several decades that have improved our lives, especially the PC, the internet, the laptops, the mobile phones. Who would ever thought we'd have a phone that has as much computing power as the computers that took the first men to the moon in 1969? And we can call literally anyone in the world through WhatsApp or some other app for free. That is truly amazing. Email, we don't need the post office anymore. We can reach people instantaneously with text messages as well through our iPhone. DNA testing, MRIs, microprocessor. The list goes on and on. It's really an incredible list of all the inventions, innovations, developments that have taken place because men and women, no matter what the state of the economy is, will continue to invent. I've been fortunate enough to meet a lot of inventors over the past several years as a business professor at various meetings, and they are the most talented people we have because they're curious about the world around them. They want to make the world better for us, and they continue inventing and creating, unlike Bernie Sanders, who just wants to give stuff away for free. So that's the point I would make, is that Bernie Sanders does not understand the economy, and the inventors, the innovators are the ones that are driving our economy. So there are more developments that have taken place over the last several decades. Again, the list is almost endless. I think it ends at 29 of all the major innovations. And I think that one of the biggest ones we're going to see in the next several decades is artificial intelligence. We're already seeing it, but I think it's going to have profound implications for the economy, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Now, what has affected my worldview as well as other libertarians, baby boomers like myself? I was born in 46, the first wave of the baby boomers. By the way, Donald Trump was born in 46, George W. Bush was born in 46, and Bill Clinton was born in 46. So that was an interesting year of individuals. I'm not certainly in the same level of notoriety as they are, and they're all three presidents. But the point is, the last 70 years have really had an impact. First, the Cold War. We lived in a country where in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we almost had a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union over Cuba. And I remember vividly in October 1962, a friend of mine and I were on our street where we lived in the Bronx, and we were talking about possibly seeing a mushroom cloud over Manhattan. So that's the framework in which I grew up as a youngster, as a high school student, that the possibility of nuclear annihilation hung over our heads. And then a year later, less than a year later, President Kennedy at a commencement address at, I think it was Georgetown University. It's on YouTube. Everyone should watch it. And in that address, he said, we have to live in peace. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis really made him realize that we must have peaceful relations with the Soviet Union. And that August of 63, he and the Soviet Union signed a test ban treaty. And then in November of 63, he was assassinated. So I think the evidence demonstrates clearly is that the deep state, the military-industrial complex, was responsible for Kennedy's assassination. The point I would make when Lee Harvey Oswald, who supposedly was the lone gunman, when he was captured, he said, I didn't kill the president. No one has charged me with that. And if someone has a goal of killing the president of the United States, you would think that they would boast about it if they were captured to say, listen, I beat the Secret Service, I beat the FBI, I beat all the protection around the president. But he didn't say that. He said he was a patsy. And there are so many wonderful books about this subject. The best one that I've read was JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Mattered, by James Douglas. It is a riveting book of all the back channels that took place during the Cuban Missile Crisis and how Kennedy realized we must have peace. And so these political assassinations, the Kennedy and King assassinations in 68, these are things that affected our generation growing up in the 1960s, that peace had to come, otherwise there would be a horrendous consequence. And fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. Unfortunately, we've had, as the screen shows, undeclared wars. We've had the two Gulf Wars that caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in the Mideast. We're still involved in the Mideast, 19 years after we went into Afghanistan. It's incredible that we're still there. The military-industrial complex really determines U.S. foreign policy. And the point I would make, and I didn't make this in October, but I'm going to make it right here, a very provocative point, that the Kennedy assassination could be the last assassination we had in America. Now we have the impeachment. So the question is the impeachment being done in order to get rid of Trump because he wants peace in the Mideast? At least he claims to say that. Or is he going to go full hog with the neocons and create some sort of confrontation with Iran, which is the big devil now in the world, according to the neocons? And so we've had the civil rights movement, which had a huge impact on me and our generation. For most of us, we thought that the civil rights movement, the civil rights legislation was a good idea of correcting a wrong. Unfortunately, as I got older, I realized this was a gross infringement on property rights and individual rights and contract. And so the goal was good, but the means, I think, were contrary to libertarian ideas of peace and non-intervention. And I think culturally and politically and socially, these things would have been resolved peacefully without the legislation, but that's a story for another day. What else did we have for the past 70 years? The booms and busts, which I recently wrote about in my book about the Federal Reserve. And here's another example of massive government intervention with the creation of the Federal Reserve, showing us how an institution was created at the behest of the powerful financial interests in this country, because banks, as we all know, or we should know, work under a flawed business model called fractional reserve banking. And after the panic of 1907, the big bankers got together at that infamous secret meeting in Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia in 1910, and they crafted, essentially became the blueprint for the Federal Reserve Act that Woodrow Wilson signed in 1913. And since the Federal Reserve was created, we've had booms and busts, a decade-long depression of the 1930s, and back-to-back bubbles in the last 20 years. And now we have what people have called the everything bubble. Everything is inflated, from housing, from artwork, and of course the stock market, the bond market. So we're seeing a massive bubble. And the question is, when is it going to pop? And there's evidence that it will pop next year after the election. So we'll just wait and see. But I think people have to take precaution in their personal financial situation to make sure that they don't see their portfolio decline 50% or more, which is we saw a 50% decline from 2007 to 2009. So as I'm approaching retirement, I have to be extremely careful about my 401k as to how it's positioned, given what I think is coming down the pike, namely this bubble bursting. And then the question becomes, whoever's president in 2021, what will they do? What will the Federal Reserve do? Will they open up the monetary spigots at the Federal Reserve? Will they spend money like crazy? The deficit is now $1 trillion. What is it going to go when we have, excuse me, higher unemployment down the road? What if we have 7, 8, 10, 12% unemployment 1, 2, 3 years down the road? The deficit right now is $1 trillion with 3.5% unemployment. The deficit could rise to $2-3 trillion as the government tries to spend our way out of the next downturn in the economy. So that's what I'm concerned about. In other words, the 2020s could be the roaring 20s again, where they pump so much money in that they create another massive bubble. And then we see a huge bubble bursting by the end of the decade, which would coincide with the 100th anniversary of the crash of 1929. So these are the possibilities of the upcoming decade that we're in, that we could see all hell breaking loose in the financial sector, which leads me to a most important question is, how long will the dollar be the world's reserve currency? And we know that the British pound went by the wayside, the Dutch guilder, and other countries' currencies over the centuries. So the question now becomes, when will the dollar lose its preeminent status as the world's reserve currency? Or will the dollar go back to its original variation as a unit weight of gold? In other words, the dollar was defined as 1/20th of an ounce of gold. Will we see the gold standard return, with the Federal Reserve trying to be good stewards of the integrity and purchasing power of the dollar down the road? That is hard to predict. All I know is from reading of financial history and monetary history, the dollar keeps on being inflated. And we know the Russians and the Chinese and other central banks are increasing their gold reserves. So they're getting very leery of holding on to dollars. And I think we're going to see some changes in the reserve status of the dollar somewhere down the road. Again, very tough to predict. The next phase of my life that began in 1997 when I was a Libertarian Party candidate for governor, and we made political history in the state. We raised enough money to get matching funds from the state, a 2-for-1 match after a certain threshold. And I was in 3 debates with the incumbent governor, Christy Whitman, and the Democratic candidate, Jim McGreevey. And I got nearly 5% of the vote. And a week before the election, since the election, the polls were so close, I was polling in the double digits. And so what happened is people broke for Whitman and McGreevey, and Whitman won by, I think, less than 1%, and I got nearly 5%. And so people think I took votes away from Whitman. The truth of the matter, if you look at the data after the election, I took votes away from both. I didn't take votes away. I got votes from Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. In fact, the most votes I got per county was in the county in which Jim McGreevey was mayor, Woodbridge, New Jersey, and he was also state senator. Dual office holding used to be is the coin of the realm in New Jersey. They passed a law many years ago saying you can't hold dual offices, but people have been grandfathered in. Anyway, what did I accomplish in that 1997 general election? Well, there were three things. One is I called for auto insurance deregulation. You would think a Republican governor would do that since the Republicans claimed that for free enterprise and limited government. Well, that didn't happen until McGreevey got elected in 2001. He basically implemented my insurance plan of deregulation. And since then, we've had very tame auto insurance rates. And that's been a great help to the people of New Jersey. What's another thing? We had a 55 mile an hour speed limit on all the highways in New Jersey. And you know, we have the Turnpike, the Garden State Parkway, roads meant to be driven 65 or higher. I campaigned on a 65 speed limit. My two opponents campaigned on a 55 speed limit because they probably did focus groups. Senior citizens wanted a 55 speed limit. Well, needless to say, after the election, Whitman got the 65 speed limit implemented on many of the state's major highways, especially the New Jersey Turnpike, saving drivers tons of money in tickets. Now, one of the most important things we did during the campaign is I had a lawn sign on my lawn saying Sabrin for governor. One day when I came home from teaching, this was October 1997, I got a handwritten note in my mailbox saying you violated section such and such of the municipal ordinance that political signs are not allowed on your own property. Our campaign attorney went to the Superior Court judge who immediately threw out the ordinance, and that's part of case law in New Jersey. We struck a blow for free speech. Admittedly, it was not a great blow, but nevertheless an important one. You can now put a lawn sign on your property in the state of New Jersey, when some towns had ordinances against it. So that is what we accomplished. And then, of course, I was invited to rejoin the Republican Party in 1999, and I tried to get the Senate nomination, U.S. Senate nomination, several times, and it didn't work out because in the primaries, the bosses at the county level control the primary to the extent that they throw a lot of support to an establishment candidate, and that's what they did in 2000, 2008, and 2014. And in 2018, I ran as a Libertarian Party candidate. And the tough thing running as a Libertarian Party candidate as a U.S. Senator is that you don't get any publicity unless you can raise a fair amount of money where you get noticed. And of course, we couldn't accomplish that this time around. But nevertheless, I ran on a strong anti-interventionist platform, talking about the Fed and how it's counterproductive to the American people, and just talk about downsizing the federal government, cutting spending, and shifting decision-making from the federal government to states and locals, and of course, individuals and business decision makers. So that's what I've tried to do in the political arena, but it's very hard, as we all know, running as a libertarian or even running as a libertarian Republican, which is I did. And so one of the essence of my goal is to talk about what General Smedley Butler, who twice was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. There are only two things that we should fight for. One is the defense of our homes, and the other is the Bill of Rights. War for any other reason is simply a racket. And you can read his little monograph online, War is a Racket. It is a wonderful, wonderful little booklet. And he went overseas to fight for what he said, U.S. corporations. So we have all the evidence from sound military personnel. Even today we have military personnel, retired military personnel, warning about the dangers of interventionism around the world. And these are people that should be listened to. In the Democratic primary, Tulsi Gabbard is making a strong case for a non-interventionist foreign policy. And she's not getting any traction, which tells us where the voters are today, that as long as they don't see soldiers being killed overseas, our soldiers, they don't think there's a problem overseas, but our taxpayer dollars are helping the Saudis commit genocide in Yemen, which is a real black mark on the United States government. And I wish that Donald Trump would do something about it. So we'll see what happens. And of course, one of the problems we have, and that's why I wrote my Tax Free 2000 in the 1990s, is that the government spending is off the charts. The biggest myth in America, in American politics, is that Republicans are fiscal conservatives. Here we have the lowest unemployment in 50 years, as Trump likes to take credit for, and the deficit and spending are exploding. So there's something wrong with this picture, namely that no one's willing to say no in Washington because people are so addicted now to other people's money. That's the real opium crisis in America, OPM, other people's money. The federal government has made so many people dependent upon Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, corporate subsidies, you name it. We've got a $4.4 trillion budget in Washington. And all people talk about is how much more can we spend on programs that we think is going to improve the lives of the American people, which of course is a great myth. And so I constantly collect quotes of people who have made great insights into what's wrong with America. And Thomas Jefferson has two quotes. Everyone can read those. Horace Greeley has one of my favorite quotes. And Bernie should read this, and so should Elizabeth Warren. The darkest hour in any man's life is when he sits down to plan how to get money without earning it. And there's a new book out called The Age of Entitlement. The author was just on Tucker Carlson the other day, basically giving a libertarian explanation of what's gone wrong with America. Namely, everyone thinks they're entitled to other people's money. And so this is the challenge we libertarians have, is how to make the case that we should be focusing on financial independence, businesses, farmers, small businesses, families. We should all be financially independent. Unfortunately, the government is taxing us so much, regulating so much, which is basically an indirect tax, that people feel that they're entitled to other people's money, using the government as the vehicle, as the middleman, as the enabler for taking other people's money without permission. So what we have, as David Stockman has been writing about, is that we have a bubble economy because of what goes on in Washington, D.C. and at the Federal Reserve. And what Chairman Powell did with the Federal Reserve this year, or the past year, is lower interest rates during an economic expansion, which I don't think has ever been done before. And so what he's done is expand the bubble, postpone the day of reckoning, and when the day of reckoning comes, it's going to be worse than if we took the medicine now. So we've gone through these cycles, and we'll continue to go through them as long as the Federal Reserve thinks its job is to keep interest rates below the market rate of interest. And that's really the problem with the Federal Reserve. And here's one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite Marxists, Groucho Marx, who says, "Politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies." So Groucho, even though he was from Hollywood, he had some great satirical works with his brothers that were anti-war, anti-establishment, and this is one of his great quotes. And so the question is Bernie going to gain traction? Is he going to get the nomination? And could he win? And he could get the nomination, and guess what? He could win, because all he has to do is flip about 40, 50,000 votes in the 4 or 5 states that Trump won, and you'd have the first democratic socialist president in the United States. But Frederick Bastiat, whose 1848 book, which every libertarian should read and quote from it constantly, this quote is, I think, nails it. Socialism, like the ancient ideas from which it springs. So, in other words, socialism is not a new idea. It goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, confuses the distinction between government and society. As a result of this, every time we object to a thing being done by government, the socialists conclude that we object to its being done at all. That is why government institutions create conflict, such as education, medical care, housing, and all the other things government tries to do to improve people's lives. But what they do is create distortions, create bubbles, and infringe on people's values. So what's the next 70 years going to look like in America? And this is really, I think, something that we should be concentrating on and talk about how we can improve things in the world. But what are the trends that are already in place? In higher education, which I spent my last 35 years in, I think what we're going to see in over the next 70 years, if not sooner, is that professors are going to be superfluous, because with artificial intelligence, students can really learn most subjects through artificial intelligence, through online portals. And I'm using an online portal in two of my finance classes this semester, where the students are going to be responsible for most of the material. We're going to still meet once or twice a week in order to go over the material so they master it. But online, they can do a lot of these things interactively, so they can see where their weaknesses are. So I think higher education, we've been doing higher education the same way for 1,000 years since, I guess, Oxford University was founded. So I think higher education will have a major transformation in our lifetime, maybe not my lifetime, maybe the lifetime of my students and their children over the next 40, 50 years. Innovations and inventions will continue to increase, I think, exponentially over the next 70 years. That's why Buffett is correct. You have to be optimistic about all the products and services that are come down the pike, that sometimes we can't even think of what they will be. But I can foresee a day where innovations and inventions will be so profound that they're going to have a huge impact on our lives in terms of medicine and healthcare, which I mentioned here. The workplace, I think what's going to see in the workplace, I think the 4-day work week is going to be the standard, if not the 3-day work place, because traffic in around major metropolitan regions. I live just south of the George Washington Bridge, and I have to bypass the bridge to get to the college when I drive up here. And the traffic sometimes is an hour, 2-hour wait to get across the bridge. So I think employers realize they're losing productivity by having their employees sitting in traffic, whether it's on a bus or a car. So I can foresee the day where 3-4 days at most will be the workplace. And what the profound implication for that is, commercial real estate may take a real hit, because if you don't have to be in the workplace so much, then the demand for office space will decrease dramatically. Medical care, this is the Achilles heel of the U.S. economy, since the government now spends half of the medical expenses in the United States between Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I think we need a wholesale transformation of medical care to where we are responsible for our medical care. And the point I would make is that we are overinsured in medicine. We don't need insurance to cover a doctor's visit. We don't need insurance to cover a visit to the eye doctor or something like that. We need medical care to protect us against catastrophic loss. That's the purpose of insurance. I'm currently writing a book on that. And I just signed 2 contracts last week to write 2 books after I retire on these subjects, medical care and the boom-bust cycle, and how that impacts corporate decision-making. So I think we're going to see major changes, and I'm going to be pushing for downsizing government involvement in medicine, because, first of all, everyone talks about the Constitution, especially the Democrats during the impeachment. Have they read the Constitution? There's no authorization for the government, the federal government, to be involved in medical care. There's nothing about it. So I think we have to be honest with the American people and say, listen, we have a system that's based upon a misinterpretation, if you will, of the general welfare clause. Medical care is not a responsibility of the federal government. Neither is housing or education or a whole host of things. So again, we have to go back to a constitutional republic. And if we did that, I think we'd be in much better shape. Now, what are the social trends? Here, I'm going to make a very provocative statement, which I didn't make in my original presentation. About 15 years ago, I had an idea for a book. And the title of the book was going to be The End of Heterosexuality. I think what we're seeing is now a huge cultural shift in terms of gender identity and people self-identifying as gender. And I don't know what the implications are, but we know, given the entitlement mentality we have, is that government is going to force people who don't believe in all these cultural shifts that's taking place in society to accept people who they feel may not conform to their values. So I think we're going to see some major conflict, whether it's bakers deciding not to bake a cake for lesbian couples or anything like that. But we're seeing a major cultural shift, and unfortunately, we're seeing the emerging, we have been seeing the emerging of politics and culture where people who have different value sets than, for lack of a better term, bourgeois culture are now imposing their values on other people. And this is a dangerous trend, I think, because it's not the libertarian and right way of doing things. If you have values that are different from other people, don't try to impose your values on other people. And that's where I think I love the libertarian philosophy of live and let live, the non-aggression principle. I think if people embrace that, I think we would have a much healthier society. Again, foreign entanglements, this is the big concern that I have, that the military-industrial complex, the deep state, the neocon vision of endless war is still with us, and we have to fight this, no pun intended, tooth and nail, that we have to be apostles of peace, if you will. And this is what I think I'm committed to. After I retire, I'll continue to step up by writing about this subject. So, and here's another prediction I have, and I think this one is going to come true, given all what I've just said, the different values and preferences people have throughout the nation, is that I think we will see what happened to the Soviet Union. There's no more Soviet Union. There are different republics that made up the Soviet Union. I think there's a good chance by the end of this century, the United States of America will no longer be the United States of America. We'll have 4 or 5 or 6 different countries. I think, I wish I had a time machine to go back, to go into the future and see if that's going to happen. But my students and their children and grandchildren will see if that prediction comes true. But right now, I think there's a greater than 50-50 chance that the United States of America will no longer be one nation in the next several decades. So my wife and I, to our future generations, we wish everyone a prosperous and peaceful 70 years. That's why we created the Sabrin Center at Ramapo College, so we can have research and get student involvement to learn the principles of free enterprise and how they can participate in the market economy, the free enterprise economy, and be good social entrepreneurs and stewards of resources.
Well, Murray, that was fantastic, I have to say. You know, and it's interesting to think about what you said is going to occur or not occur. And I'm going to want to see some questions from everybody, because I'm sure they're going to have some good ones. I would make some comments off what you said for sure. So it's interesting what you said about the possible dissolution of the country in that regard. Because, yeah, what I was thinking in my own mind was as the friction of the multi-gender mentality or any of the rest of those different schisms that everybody seems to like stir up that really don't exist in truth but are kind of fabricated and therefore amplified. It might create more, not so much breaking up the country, but creating like stronger pockets where everybody tends to gravitate. Because if that baker doesn't want to make that cake, that's hurt the economy because now something didn't happen. But if that person says, well, I'm not going to waste my time going to the person I know is not going to want to do this, I'm going to now go to somebody that will do this. Now we've like doubled the economy because the others go unmolested and the others get what they want. And that's that live and let live mentality. So it'll be interesting to see where it does go, frankly, you know, to show how powerful the founding documents were to keep the republic together in spite of all of that stuff. But what's exciting, you know, is there's organizations like Liberty International and so on, where you see what's going on globally as far as the mentality of freedom and understanding the function of government. There's a lot of reasons to be very optimistic about where things are. And then to take one last step, and then I'm just looking for you to respond, is when you mentioned about where we're going to go with healthcare. Because that's something near and dear to my heart and Charles as well. We've been engaged in this for a long, long time. And we've gradually seen, and as we've been saying, healthcare in America is awesome. It's just the way it all gets paid for that's a mess.
Yeah.
And rather than try to worry, because, you know, you're right, the government's involved in all that stuff is horrible, but you're just not going to get some legislation or vote for a bunch of people to fix that. It won't be happening. You just need to kind of pull the rug out from underneath them type of thing. And that's what we're seeing, is that wholesale transformation between people wanting to just pay directly cash for the program, because now the market works. Everything's like a third party removed. So how do I know what anything costs when somebody else is paying, like you said, for a doctor's visit? How absurd, you know? So it's exciting to see, and you know, your predictions are right on track there, and it's keen to see, because we are seeing some of it come true right before our very eyes.
Well, this is the thing, is this is what Peter Drucker says. He doesn't predict the future. He just observes what's going on and tries to say what the trends are going to be the next 30, 40 years. For example, in 1960, he looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics a breakdown of employees, and he saw that white-collar workers were increasing very rapidly. So he talked about the decline in manufacturing, and that's what we've seen in America for the last 60 years.
Charles, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Jeff, and fantastic presentation, Professor Sabrin. Thanks for alluding to Peter Drucker. I met him in D.C. once when my dad was at some foundation meeting, and it was a thrill. He's one of the best thinkers and writers of this past century. I think we should do a webinar on this Peter Drucker at some point, and maybe Murray will ask you for help on that.
Well, what I would suggest your listeners read is his December 1991 op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which I constantly quote from. It profits us to strengthen nonprofits, where he basically calls for the abolition of the welfare state. I couldn't believe it when I first read it in 1991, nearly 30 years ago. And it's probably the most libertarian article written by a non-libertarian, that the welfare state, he says, is a total disaster, and that the nonprofit sector should deliver the social services that people need. And that's why he proposed greater tax credits, deductions for donations. And I'm a founding trustee of a nonprofit health center here in Spring County, based upon the Volunteers in Medicine model. So that's in my book that I'm currently writing about alternatives to government spending on medical care. And before I go on, this is my book, Why the Federal Reserve Sucks. And there'll be hopefully an announcement very soon that I will be donating my royalties to two organizations, not to be named yet. I've been in talk with my publisher about doing that in order to boost these two organizations that I've been affiliated with over the years. And I think if we get everyone on board, buy a copy of the book through Amazon, and the sales go through the roof, these two organizations, which have been in the forefront of peace and liberty and free enterprise, free markets, they'll be flush, and they'll be able to do more by having the resources to reach out to more and more people throughout the country.
I agree. Jeff, Charlie, if I can continue?
Yes, please.
And when you do announce the beneficiaries of that promotion, let Jeff and I know, and we'll do what we can to help you out.
Great.
Just to push back a little on your chart, I don't know if Murray, you can flip back to your chart with the 6 or 8 market areas you have listed there.
Right here.
Yeah, you properly condemn, big military, big finance, with the Fed sucks and all the interventionism, and of course the medical care cartel, which Jeff and I call it. There are other cronies that have captured regulations.
Oh, sure. And
some of these are the inventors you mentioned there, but they have really abused intellectual property, the government. They've gotten crony subsidies and restrictions passed and mandates.
Yeah.
And, they've hamstrung liability if their products have harm, or the ability to stop them if there's health concerns. Big telecom, big agri, big pharma,
sure,
big tech, the technology companies with their censorship. What about this technological tyranny that is casting a shadow on your optimism?
Well, this is the concern. I mean, it's very hard to compete with Facebook. I guess that there could be entrepreneurs together that could put together a platform similar to Facebook to make it a free market, more of a free market, sort of a Hyde Park type thing where people can get on their soapbox and talk about what they want. We have alternatives to AARP. We have alternatives to other organizations that seem to be more statist oriented. So the point is, it's going to take resources to do this. And collectively, if someone comes along with a great idea, we're going to have a free market, such and such, to compete with the big tech giants or big pharma or whatever the case may be. In other words, the fight for liberty is not going to be easy or inexpensive. It's going to take resources, either time and money, in order to do that. And so everyone can pitch in. Listen, there are probably millions and millions of libertarians in the country. And think of the money that the Democratic Socialists have raised in this primary campaign. they've raised hundreds of millions of dollars. So if libertarians kick in $5 a week, $10 a week, whatever the case would be, to an organization that's going to do great work, or people who are going to battle the big government in Washington, or create alternative institutions, which I would like to see, like the Volunteers in Medicine. That to me is a way of using the current system, namely getting tax deductions for charitable contributions, to have a totally free market healthcare for low-income people who can't afford medical care through either work or on their own. This is a model that's been around since the 1990s, and it works. Before that, we had the mutual aid societies. People were tied in by nationality, race, ethnicity, trade, and they had their own groups. David Beato's great book on that, From Mutual Aid Societies to the Welfare State, points out how the Great Depression really was one of the most important events in American history, because it really transformed America from a decentralized republic to a more centralized country. And I think people don't even appreciate how important the Great Depression was in transforming America from limited government and low taxes and less regulation to this Leviathan that we've been railing about for 90 years now.
David, I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Jeff. Murray, this is David Pratt Demarest with Roads to Freedom Foundation in Omaha. Howdy. So I've lived in Omaha most of my life, but I'm a fellow New Jerseyite. I was born in Paterson, and my father was born in Brooklyn and raised in Ridgewood. So right in your neck of the woods there.
Absolutely.
And, another point of trivia, I happened to be stationed in Orlando during the Cuban Missile Crisis, so I can appreciate your comments on that. The good news is that my roommate got me to read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged while I was in Orlando. So that was a game changer for me. I moved on. I'm a voluntarist now. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate your quote by Groucho, and my observation is that the political process is the problem, not the solution.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at the practical purpose of the libertarian movement, disregarding the political process, the practical purpose, as I see it, is number one, to put institutional authorities out of business. Well, how do we do that? So what I really see as the practical purpose is to move government social service monopolies back into the free market where they belong. You've mentioned healthcare and education. I think the two that governments use to justify themselves are the protection and adjudication of social services. Any comments on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I think we're going to see in the future, depending upon what happens socially, is we're going to see a lot more gated communities around the country, and people will have private security forces to protect them. But I think there's one trend that's really, I think, in our favor, and that is from the Democrats want to decriminalize low marijuana use and these non-violent activities which have now been criminalized. So I think that there's a trend in the country to say, listen, we should really concentrate on the hardcore criminals, the rapists, the murderers, the robbers, and people like that. And hopefully, with more opportunity in the country, people will resort less to crime. So again, I'm not a criminologist, but from what I've been reading, the crime numbers have been pretty optimistic the last several decades. In terms of crimes per 100,000, or however they calculate it. So there's been less crime. It's just that when you get these terrible shootings that we've seen around the country, these are the outliers. These are the black swans, if you will. They don't happen, fortunately, frequently, but they're made to seem like they're a big deal. And that's why, as someone whose father survived World War II because he had the ability to defend himself, I am a strong proponent of the Second Amendment. I'm a firearms owner. I've taken lessons. I'm a pretty good shot. So I think the Second Amendment is really our bulwark to some degree about this whole situation. But again, I'm a half glass full guy. So I'm always been optimistic throughout my lifetime. And given what I see happening, we just have to be vigilant. That's what trying to get more liberty is all about, is be vigilant. I've had a platform in my neck of the woods in northern New Jersey. The editor of the local paper publishes my op-eds and letters to the editor frequently. So I'm reaching a couple 100,000 people every time I write an article or a letter. And people in my co-op that I live in compliment me on them because they're well written and they're common sense about the issues that affect their lives. So again, you don't have to engage in fiery rhetoric. You just have to point out the counterproductive nature of government spending, intervention, and foreign policy, and you win people over.
One thing, Murray, about what you said in there, it comes out of three key things: that you be persistent, that you're vocal, but most importantly, that all you ever do is speak common sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because everybody else doesn't speak common sense, so you don't have to be flamboyant or scandalous. You just continue to be the voice of reason, and you're going to win in the end. Because eventually, people heard that message. Say, "Wait a minute, why am I not doing this? Guy's like making total sense to me." Boom, you're in. No, it's great. All right, we've got some other time for like another question here. So let's see who's maybe got something here to throw into the mix. Let's see here, Jeff. Are you unmuted? Jeff, are you there?
Yeah, I'm sorry I got delayed with another call.
I was just curious if you had any kind of comments on what you heard so far.
Well, I got delayed, and so it's not really even fair for me to.
Okay, well, you'll hear the recording in the future when we get this released, so that you're the perfect person. That's what happens. Then in today's one thing I'll tell you this: I never predicted, Murray. No time of any day of any week is good to have a meeting. None. There's not one day or time, anytime of the whole week. There's never a time to have a meeting because no one can make them anymore.
Well, here's how you guarantee to have an audience. Make sure it's the biggest snow day of the.
There you go. How do you play exactly the power outage or not that the big snow day? That's a good one. All right, let's see. Who else have we got here? Anybody else at the moment? No? All right, well, that's good. All right, well, that was really interesting to be sure. It's nice to see kind of where you think things are going to go, and you've been a good observer. So, and a lot of it we can see the trends you're describing, like you said. It's not so much trying to predict the future, but spot the trends.
Yep.
Where's society at large going? And that's what makes the market great. I can't determine whether McDonald's is going to be more successful than Burger King. All the millions of people that go there every day are going to figure that out for me.
Absolutely. Well, this is the beauty of Austrian economics. It's really about explaining the world around us rather than trying to predict the world. And this is what's wrong with the Bernies and the Elizabeth Warrens of the world. They want to shape the world in their image. In other words, they're playing God with us, and that I think is very, very frightening. And that's why I'll continue to speak out against this trend toward this quote soft socialism. But we know soft socialism can turn into hard socialism, where people will be rounded up and incarcerated for bad ideas or bad beliefs.
Yeah, and that would happen quickly once they got that upper hand there for sure. So there's no question about that. And it plays to that great quote, the fatal conceit, because that's really what it is. They're so conceited to think that they know better than everybody else. And I forget who made the quote. It's like, I don't even know what's good for me tomorrow.
Yeah.
So how are you going to tell me? So that was great. Thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, my pleasure, Charlie and Jeff. It was great.